Stephanie, thank you very much for letting me come into your office.
I'm delighted to do this.
Can you start off by telling me who you are, where you are, and what type of position you have where you are, and what kind of work it is that you do?
So my name is Stephanie Seneff, and I'm a senior research scientist at MIT, where I have been for all of my adult life, going undergraduate, graduate school, and then staying on as a researcher for the rest of my life. My research is in computer science. I'm at the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory at MIT. And my research is in computer science, but I have an undergraduate degree in biology with a PhD in computer science. And I have been, over the last 6 years, switching back to biology, combining it with computer science, to use computer science techniques to help me understand biology and to form connections between health and environmental toxins.
So how do you interface the biology with the computer science, one? And two, give me some examples of maybe some of the papers you've published or some of the issues you've worked on combining science, biology with computer science.
So it's all based on using statistical methods, computer science statistical methods to analyze words, word frequencies, word combinations, and you can really gain a lot of insight into things that are happening by looking at words statistically. And so I started by looking at drug side effect reports, specifically focusing on statin drugs and antidepressants. And there's a tremendous amount of material out on the web these days, so you can just grab reports that are produced by patients, and they describe their experiences with drugs. And then you can sort of look at statin drug reports and compare those against reports for other kinds of drugs. And then you can use statistical methods to try to tease out what are the differences in those side effects and which side effects are showing up more frequently with the statin drugs compared to the other drugs in this age-matched distribution.
So let me make sure I understand. So you would take patient-generated reports that have complaints of supposed side effects or presumed side effects from the statins, and then you compare those with other patient-generated reports that complain of the side effects that they've had from taking other drugs.
Yes, all other drugs.
So then you tease apart what's specific to the people complaining about their side effects from statins.
That's right. So I started with that, and then I found a huge number of side effects that were quite interesting that all seemed to be related to getting older faster. Things like cataracts, hearing loss, hair loss, diabetes, arthritis, mental problems, physical weakness, so just basically physical frailty and cognitive decline. These are all things that you think of as getting old. So the conclusion that I would draw is that statins make you grow older faster. And so this, of course, was alarming to me because we have so many people taking statin drugs. And being a biologist, I was interested in why is it that this drug would cause this effect. So the first thing that I had done 6 years ago was to look at the statin drugs. And then I started looking at the literature. So reading, of course, about heart disease and cholesterol, and then about all these different papers that were experiments done looking at statin drugs' effects on cells and culture. There's a lot of material out there. And I gathered all this literature, and then you can also use the computer science techniques on the literature. So you kind of play the same game, but instead of patient reports, you have paragraphs from the literature. And you can get summaries of those paragraphs, you can get correlations in the words in the summaries, and you work all this out. And then you start to get a picture of the biology that's associated with statin drugs. And then, of course, that is the picture of the biology that's associated with cholesterol and heart disease. So what came out of that was a much better understanding of what heart disease is and what's causing it, and the realization that it's actually completely different from what we're told.
So can you explain how it's completely different? That's one question, but I want to back up and ask you a question about something that you just said, which is, if statins are being given to everyone over 40, let's say, how do you know that those complaints, those groupings of symptoms that you looked at weren't just complaints of people over 40?
Right, and in fact, you do have an issue because it could be just people who have heart problems, right? Because there is a compounding of the effect between the drug and the condition that caused you to take that drug. So that is actually an issue. So but what you have to do then is to understand the biology so that you can explain why the drug would cause this rather than why the condition would cause it. You have to understand what that drug is doing. and how that impacts your physiology. So this is what I did. And it was an amazing journey because it led me to a place that no one is thinking about, which is sulfate. And I should introduce this early because sulfate is my thing. Sulfate is a really interesting molecule, 1 sulfur and 4 oxygens. And the body uses it in amazing ways. And if the body doesn't have enough sulfate, serious problems come.
Like?
Well, first of all, it's the blood. I mean, the blood becomes unstable. And once that's the case, then depending upon your genetics, different organs will be targeted to supply sulfate to the blood. So if your genetics dictates that it's the brain that's going to do that, then you'll have cognitive problems. But if it's the muscles, then you'll have muscle weakness. Or you may get digestive problems because the digestive system is robbed of sulfate. So the sulfate is stolen from someplace in the body in order to deliver it to the blood so that the blood won't have a complete meltdown, which will kill you.
What would happen if the blood didn't get enough sulfate?
You would have no flow. You would have things like blood clots.
So clotting, increased clotting.
And then you get hemorrhaging as a reaction to the clot.
Sure.
So you've got unstable blood clots, hemorrhaging, which is something the elderly face in America. A tremendous number of elderly are being given Coumadin, which is trying to keep them from getting these blood clots. Then they end up with hemorrhaging problems. I mean, it's basically they're walking a tightrope between these two issues because of insufficient sulfate supplying the arteries, walls, and the cells that are suspended in the blood.
So the side effects that I've read about in statins, which is the muscle weakness, and in some cases almost looking like ALS.
Yes, exactly.
Would you say that in those cases, those people
Yes.
genetically were predisposed to then have their muscles donate the sulfate to
That's
the blood?
right. That's right, yes. And in fact, well, they do much more than that. In fact, with the statins, it's very interesting what happens with fructose. And a lot of people have been talking about fructose, maybe not so good, high fructose corn syrup. We're beginning to be aware that high fructose corn syrup is not something healthy. You know, it comes, of course, from GMO corn, which I think is actually maybe a major part of the problem there. But the fructose itself is quite difficult. And usually the liver processes fructose and turns it into fat. And then that fat gets shipped out inside LDL particles. But when the liver is interfered with by the statin drug, it can no longer do that because it doesn't have cholesterol that it needs to send the fructose out. So it takes a pass on the fructose, and the fructose then has to be taken up by somebody else. So the muscle cells take up the fructose. Fructose is actually very toxic. It's much more, so glucose is a glycating agent, and you cause hemoglobin A1C. When you have diabetes, you get excess sugar in your blood, and then you get glycated proteins. Fructose is 10 times as bad as glucose at glycating proteins, which is why the liver just takes it out before it even gets a chance to go to the rest of the blood. But the liver can't do that because it has the statin drug, so the muscles do it, and then they get killed by the fructose.
So if you measure the glycosylation of the proteins, the glycation of the proteins in the muscles, they would be heavily glycated.
Yeah, and in fact, excess, so the muscles turn the fructose into lactate, and lactate is actually a terrific fuel. But statin drugs are associated with excess lactate in the blood, so that's just confirmation that this is happening. And the muscle cells are also deficient in sulfate, which is preventing them from properly processing the glucose. So it's all tied together. You get the diabetes, which statins have been shown to cause diabetes, and that makes complete sense because you need the sulfate, and the sulfate gets transported by cholesterol. So the whole thing, it's an amazing, amazing story that works out so beautifully. And more than that, when you start looking at the actual plaque itself, the cardiovascular plaque that's associated with heart disease, and you say, what's going on there? And you read the papers, you throw them into the computer, do the stuff, and you find connections, and then you realize that what the plaque is doing is it is taking in cholesterol from LDL. LDL is the bad guy, saving it in the macrophages, waiting for an opportunity to get sulfate. Getting sulfate is hard at this point, so you have to have inflammation to generate the superoxide, which is going to combine with the sulfur to make sulfate. So inflammation is really behind all the modern diseases. They're starting to realize that more and more. That's producing the superoxide is producing the sulfate, and then the platelets in the plaque take the cholesterol from the macrophages, combine it with the sulfate, and make cholesterol sulfate. And cholesterol sulfate is a fantastic molecule that the heart desperately needs. So the heart is actually deficient in cholesterol and deficient in sulfate in heart disease. It's the exact opposite of what they're saying. They're saying it is an excess cholesterol problem, and it's actually a deficiency. And
well, we're led to believe that cholesterol is bad.
Yes, which is completely foolish. cholesterol is essential to all the membranes of all the cells. The brain has 25% of the body's cholesterol with only 2% of the body's mass. The brain really needs cholesterol to work properly, which is why you get all the cognitive problems when you take a statin drug.
Well, and also the statin, it blocks acetyl-CoA, correct?
It blocks this critical step in the pathway, which leads to cholesterol, as well as to a lot of other really, really important things that the biology depends on. So it's not just cholesterol that gets disrupted by the statin.
It's the CoQ10.
Yes, that's right.
So to recap, because you threw out so much information, and I followed and I find fascinating.
Yes.
But the bottom line on your conclusion, and not only your conclusion, I've been reading this from other people doing research. The bottom line on your conclusion with your work looking at statins and side effects and biology is?
Yes, the bottom line is that the cholesterol in heart disease is a deficiency rather than an excess. And excess LDL is an indication of impairment in production of cholesterol sulfate. And the plaque is actually there serving a very useful purpose to produce the cholesterol sulfate that the heart desperately needs. When the plaque is interfered with, as it is through statin drugs, you end up with things like heart failure, valve problems, all of these things that are arrhythmias that are a consequence of insufficient cholesterol and insufficient sulfate in the heart.
But what if there's plaque that's blocking the artery?
Well, so they always talk about blocking the artery with plaque, but that actually is not what's happening. The real thing behind a heart attack is thrombosis, which is a blood clot. And so this is a consequence of the blood being unstable. So the plaque is actually very good at growing on the outside of the artery and allowing the artery to still flow. Or if the artery is blocked, the body has the ability to make collateral bypass arteries, natural bypass arteries that will allow the blood to flow around an artery that's getting blocked. So the heart is able to a large degree, compensate for these fatty deposits that it's building and find a way to keep on supplying the blood to the heart. Within limits, of course, because you don't really, heart disease is not a good thing, but in the context of the deficiency that you have in cholesterol and sulfate, it's a much better option to have the plaque than it is to disrupt the plaque and end up with heart failure, in my opinion.
What would be an alternative to developing plaque? What would be the right thing to do so you don't develop plaque?
Right.
And you have enough sulfate. I mean, what can people do?
Well, getting enough sulfate is the problem. And actually, that's really interesting because then I kept on looking, okay, fine, the statins are disrupting the sulfate. What else might be disrupting the sulfate? And in fact, a huge issue is glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup.
The active ingredient in Roundup?
Roundup, the weed killer.
And Roundup has been around since?
1974.
And so did we see a huge spike in heart disease since the introduction of Roundup?
Well, so Roundup is causing a lot of things, and one of the big things it's causing is obesity and diabetes. There's extremely high correlation between Roundup and obesity and diabetes. Roundup usage on corn and soy, GMO corn and soy in the U.S. correlates very, very strongly with the rise in diabetes, obesity, kidney failure, Alzheimer's disease, autism. All of these diseases, including thyroid problems, are very strongly matched with specifically the rise in the use of Roundup on GMO corn and soy.
Is this just a temporal association, or are you saying that there's a mechanism which is understood by people in biology?
Well, this is the thing, exactly. So in fact, so you see, so I actually wasn't aware of this incredibly matched statistics until after I had written a paper on Roundup. I wrote a paper with Anthony Samsel, which was published just in April of this year, on Roundup's effect on health. And again, looking at all the literature, running it through the computer science, figuring out the connections, and then finding a remarkable story that caused me to identify Roundup as causing exactly these things that turned out to be very highly correlated, which I had missed. And we hadn't talked about that in the paper. We didn't see that correlation from the statistics. It was something that I was informed about afterwards, after we wrote the paper. Nancy Swanson is a physicist who has published a whole bunch of plots of correlations between Roundup and many different conditions that are on the rise today in our country. Really, really striking correlations with like a 0.98 correlation coefficient.
That's huge.
It's really amazing.
That is amazing. So with what you spoke about earlier, the statins and the diseases, I mean, I certainly read numerous papers. Many other people are in agreement with you. is this just your finding on the Roundup and all these diseases, or are there other than the few people you've mentioned?
Well, so yeah, no, Roundup is interesting because it's amazing to me how well Monsanto seems to have been able to keep people from researching Roundup, is the only thing I can conclude. Because there was so little, I couldn't find any studies on the effects of Roundup, for example, on humans. There are some studies, we found lots of studies, but we had to dig hard, and they're in obscure journals. Anthony and I really did our best to find everything we could on the subject. Because actually, so what led me to Roundup was that I had been studying autism, really, really wanted to get to the bottom of autism. I could see that the rates were going up and up and up. And 6 years ago, when I also started studying the statins, I also started studying vaccines because I figured vaccines, I mean, a lot of people have said vaccines might be related. There's the mercury. And so I looked at the VAERS database, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. And very powerful to use VAERS database and use exactly the same procedures that we used for the statin drugs on the vaccines. And we discovered all kinds of interesting things. And again, you go back to the literature, you study the literature. So it's always a combination of looking at the data in some database and relating it to the data in the literature and using the same computer science techniques on both sets of data to interpret the biology behind the things that you're seeing from the analysis.
So you're saying you're looking at one database, which is patient-generated. Again, I mean, the VAERS reporting system is a national reporting system, but it's generated from patients' adverse events from the vaccinations, correct?
Yes, right.
And then you're saying that you compare that to the data that you can find in the research
yes, exactly.
on the vaccines or on the Roundup or on the statins, whatever it is.
Yeah, or even on these symptoms that you're seeing from the vaccines. With the vaccines, for example, we related it to, of course, autism. I mean, and others have shown this too. For example, we found 0.001 as a p-value for the likelihood of this distribution occurring by chance, which means that it's extremely unlikely that it's occurring by chance in looking at the relationship between the hepatitis B vaccine and autism.
So, many factions of the government say it's a genetic epidemic. I mean,
I know, and I find that very frustrating because they're spending so much money. Even here at MIT, a lot of money is being spent on the genetic aspects of autism and looking for the genes that might be causing autism, which I think is really, I mean, we may learn something, we are learning something from the genetics because you're finding out which genes are being hurt by the environment, is what you're finding.
So which genes may be activated or suppressed or altered from environmental triggers.
Exactly. Yes, and then I think the environmental triggers will actually cause the genes to mutate as an attempt to try to find some other way to work that's going to work better than the way that it is now, because in the context of this environment, that gene isn't working properly. It's being disrupted. And so those genes that are being affected are the ones that are under siege by the environment. And so that's helpful because that's actually one way you can point to sulfate. So I got to sulfate both from the statin drugs and from the vaccines. It was really interesting that I was studying autism and I was studying heart disease, and the two studies merged into the same story, which was sulfate. This is what's bad, because I have identified really, I mean, three key things that I've identified that are really devastating in the modern environment for the very reason that they're considered safe: aluminum, statin drugs, and glyphosate. Glyphosate is Roundup.
Okay, so you've done a lot of this. I would say that your research is a lot of hot buttons. How are you received at MIT? And are there people trying to kick you out because you're bucking the industry?
Remarkably, MIT has been very good to me. And in fact, the head of our lab of CSAIL is invited me to give a talk in front of all the professors, a 15-minute talk at our off-site meeting this past June on glyphosate, on Roundup. And so, I have not had anyone tell me I can't do this, and I've got funding for it. So, I mean, things are going well.
So you have funding for all the research you've spoken about up to
Yes.
this point. You have funding for.
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming that the funding is not from the pharmaceutical
No.
or food industry.
It's from a computer company.
It's from a computer company.
Yeah, in Taiwan. So it's pretty much protected from all of this, fortunately.
And they like what you're doing.
Yes, so they like the computer science, the idea of applying computer science in order to understand biology, using computer science to analyze the literature and to analyze the data that's on the web. They like all of that.
Mm-hmm. And does MIT, I mean, I'm just curious if this department has, if there's people that have a lot of funding from pharmaceutical or agricultural industry.
Luckily, and I checked this out, Monsanto has given very little to MIT ever, and I don't know that they're giving any money to MIT right now. So I'm really glad about that, because I think many people, I've heard from people from agricultural universities who have said that they absolutely cannot touch glyphosate because of Monsanto funding.
So
of
isn't
the
that
university.
interesting? You're telling me that you have colleagues that work at universities that have a lot of agricultural science going on.
Yes,
And those
off
universities can't
limits.
study, it's off limits.
I think glyphosate is completely off limits, which is why it's not being studied. I think Monsanto will be terrified to find, for people to find out. I think they can't, I cannot imagine that they don't know how bad their product is on our health.
So who approved glyphosate and Roundup? Who approves it?
Yeah.
And what studies were they basing the approval on, that it was safe to introduce into
the
our food
EPA,
chain?
we basically, Monsanto has done studies for 3 months showing no harm. And there was a researcher in France, Seralini, who did a study over the entire lifespan of rats and showed that exposure to glyphosate over the lifespan caused all kinds of problems in terms of tumors and early death and uterine problems in the females, and just generally a lot of issues for these rats if you look over the entire lifespan. But the Monsanto studies always look over only 3 months, and Seralini didn't see his problems until starting at 4 months.
Interesting.
After 3 months, things were fine. After 4 months, they started to degrade.
So the EPA approved glyphosate or Roundup based on Monsanto's own study, short-term study.
Right.
And that was it.
Yes. And what amazes me is that the evidence is so strong, in my opinion, from, again, the obscure studies that are being done and reported in the obscure journals. There's quite a few of those that are looking at sort of cells in culture. For example, you can show that in parts per trillion, it will cause breast cancer cells to multiply. So it's inducing tumor growth in parts per trillion, which is extremely small, minute amounts.
And so there's a conundrum that I'm hearing, is that the universities that have agricultural science departments can't do these.
Their hands are tied.
Their hands are tied, so they can't do this research.
Right.
So the research has to come from outside agricultural science.
That's right.
And then when those papers are published, the industry can point their finger and say, well, they're not experts in the field.
Exactly. I think that's exactly the game. Or you publish it in a journal that is not in their sort of inner circle of respected journals, which they can police. I believe they must be making sure that all the journals that they will claim to be prestigious are the ones that they're going to make sure that these things don't get into those journals. And therefore, you're publishing outside of that prestigious inner circle. And then they can say, well, you're publishing in a journal that's not prestigious, and therefore we're not going to, So I think there's a wonderful thing going on right now with open access journals. I think this is so terrific, and I think really interesting papers are coming out more and more. And these journals are publishing papers that are available to everybody. That most of the journals and the prestigious journals are locked behind a paywall. You have to shell out $40 to read one paper, unless you've got access to libraries, from universities and things like that.
But where are these people getting their funding to do the research? You're lucky. You've got a Korean, a Taiwanese computer company funding you.
Yes.
But I would say that's probably not
That's
common.
probably very, very unusual, yes.
So who's even funding?
I
Who
know,
can afford to
that's
study
right.
something that bucks the industry?
Well, in fact, I think an interesting idea is to use, and I have been considering this, is to use crowdsourced funding. Just like you're doing, for example.
Yeah.
Crowdsourced funding would be the way to go.
People are doing that with research. I have seen some.
Yes, well, we've been thinking of trying to do something like that. We've been talking about it, but we haven't got it off the ground yet, but we're considering that.
So I see now, though, the conundrum, which is
And in
very
fact,
clear.
Seralini got funding from the opposition to, the sort of GMO, anti-GMO community. And of course, that's a reason. Well, Monsanto has worked very hard to discredit his work, this paper about the rats. And part of his attempt to discredit was because he got funding from the anti-GMO movement. So it's really ironic that.
But I see the conundrum, which is that if you can't even get funding and you're at an institution which should be studying Roundup, right? I mean,
I know.
a study,
Those,
an
the
institution-
agricultural ones are the ones that should be doing it, and I don't think any of them will.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's really disturbing. Now, if you look at, for example, Argentina, I mean, there's some really interesting things coming out of Argentina right now in terms of the health of the kids that are being exposed to the Roundup that's being used on the GMO corn and soy. GMO soy, they have massive GMO soy productions in Argentina right now. And the people who live in those agricultural areas are getting a lot of health issues with their children. So children are being born with many unusual birth defects in Argentina.
That live in the area.
That live in the area where there's a lot of Roundup being used on the GMO soy.
Right, and of course, so if you have GMO, then you're actually using more Roundup,
yes,
correct?
This is right, and this is actually the exact opposite of what they said would happen. So they had said that by having the GMO soy you would use less, but in fact the amount of Roundup that's being used, for example, even in America on the corn and soy, is just going up and up and up over
Why
the
is
last
that?
10 years. They develop resistant weeds. So because of, in the context of the engineered crops, the weeds become resistant to Roundup. And so you spray the Roundup, the weed doesn't die. So you have to put more Roundup, or you have to then add some other toxic chemical, like 2,4-D or atrazine, some other weed killer on top of Roundup in order to kill these obnoxious weeds that won't die.
So if Argentina is now saying that their children are being born with birth defects in the areas of the farms growing this GMO corn or soy with all the extra, what is is the government doing anything? Is there more action going on in Argentina than here in terms of waking up and saying that there's a problem?
No, I think not, because I think Argentina is making an enormous amount of money on the GMO soy. They're shipping it out all around the world. They only use about 10% of what they produce. And it's been kind of a lifesaver for them in terms of their economy, because they were struggling. And then by switching from, and in fact it just kills me that they switched from grass-fed beef, which is something is really, really a healthy food, to GMO soy as their major product. So it's really, really sad.
It's one big web.
Yes.
You know, it's really one problem leads to another problem, one solution leads to another problem, then they create something for the solution, it's another problem. So where is your work now? Like, where are you headed? Are you working on a paper putting all this together? You know, what's in the future?
I'm completely overwhelmed. I'm working on several papers in parallel, some of which are under review, some of which are back from review, and others that are being prepared and haven't yet been submitted. I have papers on all these different topics that I'm working on. Anthony and I have another paper on Roundup on celiac disease, which is under review right now. And we found an amazing number of links between Roundup and celiac disease, gluten intolerance, which has all of a sudden sprung up out of nowhere. We have all of these grocery stores now with a gluten-free section because so many people are intolerant to gluten. And what people don't realize is that wheat is not GMO, but there's an increasing practice lately of spraying Roundup on the wheat right before the harvest. And this allows it to ripen. It kills it, and then it ripens quickly and releases its seed, and you get an improved harvest. It also cuts back on the amount of debris you have to clear.
Wait, it kills it and then it ripens it? I don't understand.
Yeah, it's really amazing that you would spray something on the crop intentionally to kill it right before the harvest. And as the crop is gasping its last breath, it releases its seeds, so it goes to seed aggressively, and they get a better yield. And then on top of that, it has less residue because it dies right after you harvest it. And they're getting a head start on next year's weeds by using this Roundup at that point, right at the end of when they need to have, they no longer need to have that plant living, so they kill it right before the harvest. So the Roundup ends up in the wheat.
And you're saying the way the Roundup affects the villi in the
Yes, you mean the digestive tract? Yes, absolutely. The Roundup binds to the wheat, I think, and that's what causes the wheat to be allergenic.
Interesting.
And then, so we just looked at all these different features that are associated with celiac disease. Celiac disease is a very complex disease and it has a lot of different aspects to it, other things that are problematic in association with celiac disease. But then we can show that Roundup can also be connected to those things. So we did a whole bunch of connecting the dots in this paper, which has not been published yet. So we have to see if it's going to make it past review. But.
And have you received any phone calls from? I mean, when you've published your papers, does the media call you you know?
You know, not the media so much, but lots and lots of people from all walks of life, and that's been really quite overwhelming, but also quite interesting. The people that I've contacted, I've been talking several phone calls with a veterinarian from pig country in Iowa. He's a veterinarian in Iowa, and he's been taking care of the pigs in these big farms that have these CAFOs, you know, and the pigs are having all kinds of problems with their health in association with eating GMO foods. And so one of the things he does to treat the pigs is to put them on an organic diet.
And then they get better.
And then they get better. And you know, inflammatory gut, I mean, so this is where it gets, you're seeing the same. I'm also looking at horses. I've been in touch with someone who's an expert on race horses. And she breeds them, she raises them, and she's very concerned about the race horses and all the problems they're having lately. And I've been looking at the problems they're having and linking them up to human problems. So I'm planning on writing a paper that shows how the connections between the problems the racehorses are having, the pigs are having, and the humans are having are all connected to the GMO crops and the Roundup in them, I suspect.
Have you received any calls from veterinarians regarding the work you did with vaccines?
I mean, well, it's a good point because they have issues with vaccines as well.
They do, but I have to say that one of my patients probably 20 years ago was a veterinarian, and he was shocked that vaccines for children had thimerosal because he said that it was removed from veterinary vaccines in the 80s because it caused like mad cow behavior, you know, kind of weird behavior. And I just recently brought one of my cats to be spayed, and the veterinarian there said that, you know, they have clean vaccines and dirty vaccines. And I said, what's the difference? He said, well, dirty vaccines have aluminum and clean vaccines don't, and we always try to give a clean vaccine.
Wow.
And I said, wow, we don't have that delineation.
I am thinking that the animals may actually give us answers sooner than the humans will, with respect to both the foods and the vaccines.
Because it's a shorter life cycle and we can see more clearly.
Yes,
Is that
that's right, yes. And also maybe we're a little bit more careless too, because I know the animals are allowed to have a lot more Roundup. The residue limits are higher, significantly higher for the animals than they are for the humans.
Well, but if it's for the animals and they're feed animals,
I know.
then humans are getting it.
Exactly.
Because they're getting the residue.
And we have no idea how much because they're not measuring it at all in the animal products. And they're hardly ever even measuring it in the crops. We were trying, Anthony and I in writing our paper, were trying to get some evidence of Roundup in the food. And the only thing we could find was a 195-page document published by the U.S. Department of Agriculture in 2011 on pesticides usage in crops and measures of the foods to see how much was in there, the residues. They had all this material in there. We searched the entire paper. We found one line in the entire document on glyphosate. But that one line was very powerful. It was on soy, 300 samples of soy. And they looked at the amount of glyphosate, whether there was glyphosate residue and how much, and they found it in over 90% of the 300 samples. And they found AMPA, which is a glyphosate breakdown product, in 96% of the soy. So basically, it's all over the soy.
And does it bioaccumulate? I mean, does it, you know, does it?
Well, they claim that it, you know, that it gets broken down fast in the soil, that it gets broken down fast in the body, but this is not at all proven. And in fact, in certain soil types, I've been told by some people that have contacted me that it can stick around for a year in the soil, or it binds to all these important minerals. And one of the things that I think is really a problem is it depletes the minerals. And so part of what you're seeing in the health issue is a severe deficiency in one of these rare minerals like cobalt or molybdenum, things that you don't really think about, and that the body would expect to have in just minute amounts. But even those minute amounts are not there. And particularly when you go through the processing that we go through with these foods.
Are we seeing the trace mineral deficiencies in the animals that are eating the feed?
I think that's part of what's causing all of their problems, you know, like their gut problems and everything else.
And so my question is, if you eat pig or cow that eats...
then if that food is also depleted, presumably, right?
Well, not only that, I mean, are you getting the bioaccumulation? Are you getting the Roundup that they ate?
I know. We have no clue, actually. I don't think anyone has measured that.
Have people tried to look at this in research? I know with GMO seeds that I've spoken with some researchers who said they can't even get the seeds to study.
Yeah.
That they won't, you know...
Anthony and I are trying to do some studies on GMO on glyphosate residues and also the effect of glyphosate on corn, GMO corn, Anthony's actually doing some experiments and getting some interesting early results. We haven't published that. It's another paper, but that's coming along sooner or later. It's expensive to measure Roundup. So one thing is we're paying for it out of pocket, actually.
Wow.
Thousands of dollars, Anthony and I are, to get these measures of glyphosate residues in the corn that he's growing. So you can't get the funding. If you're going to pay for it out of pocket, you've got to send it off to, very few labs will even do it. And it's expensive, so it really is difficult.
The countries that have banned GMO, did they ban GMO because they did these studies? Or, I mean, we haven't banned, it seems like the countries that use the most GMO are not the countries that they're supposedly designed for, which is, impoverished countries.
I know.
It's the U.S. and Canada that utilizes the most
and
GMO.
We don't have any GMO labeling in these two countries, whereas many of the other countries in the world have the GMO labeling requirement. And Europe is much more sensitive, much more aggressive about protection from these things. We have Monsanto headquarters in St. Louis, and I think that's a lot of it. It's just that we're really in deep. We're in long and deep with this notion of growing these crops by just kind of killing off everything except the one monocrop that you want to grow. The efficiency of it, the economical, you're basically we pay much less for our food than most other countries. We get cheap food, processed food, and extremely poor quality food with severe deficiencies in micronutrients.
But we do pay the price.
We pay the price.
We spend
because
more on health care than any other country.
I think that's exactly why. I think our health care is out of sight just because we're sick, and we're sick because we're not eating properly. And the doctors don't seem to have any interest in nutrition, which is shocking to me, because nutrition is the way to be healthy is to get good nutrition. And that doesn't just mean eating processed foods, it's just so depleted.
Well, most doctors think the way to get healthy is to take a lot of vaccinations and a lot of medications, right?
The whole system is geared on anti-life. You basically, you kill off the microbes in the soil even, and you kill off all the pests that might eat your plant, and then you vaccinate to kill off all the microbes that might infect your body, and then you take all these drugs which are interfering with life in the sense that they're disrupting some enzyme somewhere that's probably very critical to a whole bunch of different functions. So the whole thing is just interfering with life. It's such a strange model.
I've never heard anyone put it that way, but wow. I've never thought of it that way until you just said that, but it's, the soil organisms are so important for us. They're so healthy. People go out of their way and buy soil organisms to replenish their bowel flora or their gut flora.
The gut flora, we have 90% of the cells in our body are foreign. They're microbes. They're not us.
And
they outnumber us 10 to 1. Yeah, and we eat all these things that just mess up our gut bacteria. That's the whole thing with the Roundup, that it kills preferentially the beneficial bacteria and lets the pathogens overgrow. And then you get into all this inflammatory gut, and then from there you go downhill with all kinds of other problems.
Well, and then you get infected, and then your immune system's not as good, so right. Same with viral and bacterial. Like viruses and bacteria are everywhere, but the focus is, let's kill all of them. But that's not really the right approach.
When you start to realize the whole system and the way it's, I have come to appreciate that biology. We live in a symbiotic relationship with all the other species. And all of them, even the pathogens, are actually doing something good for us. And this is something I'm really excited about lately that I've learned about the flu vaccine. And I'm actually going to be giving some slides on that in November. I'm giving a whole day seminar in November on all my ideas about sulfate and everything else. And one of the topics will be the flu virus. And what's really interesting about that virus is that it goes into the muscle cells and it reprograms them to basically hand over their sulfate to the flu virus. And then the cell releases those viruses, and they carry the sulfate on their backs, and they deliver it to the blood. So what's happening is the flu virus is rescuing the blood from a meltdown. And when you look at it that way, you think, oh my goodness, when you get sick with the flu, it's actually helping you out because your blood desperately needs that sulfate, and the flu virus is the messenger that's allowed to deliver the sulfate.
And is that just influenza, or is it a lot of
Well, then
other
it starts
viruses?
to be a lot of other viruses too. Once you see that with flu and you start to look, and then, so chlamydia pneumonia is really amazing because it's a virus that shows up in pneumonia. It also hangs out in the cardiovascular plaque, and it hangs out in Alzheimer's plaque, chlamydia pneumoniae. And this microbe is really interesting because it makes heparin sulfate, a particularly important sulfated molecule. It makes a form of that using a unique set of enzymes that no other species has.
So you're saying it's a good thing to get chlamydia pneumonia?
It has a unique way to make heparin sulfate that probably gets around, for example, deficiencies in some critical nutrients that we need in order to make it, so that this organism can make it for us. Where we fail, it can succeed. And if you start to look at all the organisms that way, you start to see how that works.
So that if your immunity is, if you have good immunity, so you're healthy, that you don't even necessarily notice you have these things, or you might have a mild version.
Right,
You
so
come
when
out
you get
stronger.
the measles, you know, and some kids get the measles and they've got spots all over their body, and other people just barely have anything. That's a reflection of the degree to which those people are deficient in sulfate. The measles is rescuing them. That's what I'm suspecting. When I look, I'm starting to work all this out, and I still have to work out a lot of the details. In each case, you have to study it carefully, and sometimes you can't find it. But it's looking that way to me, like everything. An infection, then, if you think about if the gut is unable to transport, say, cobalamin, which is a very big molecule, because it's broken, the gut's broken, well, so you could transport the cobalamin by having it be carried on the back of a microbe that breaks through the leaky gut. So in a way, the gut leaks in order to let the microbes in, because the microbes can carry important nutrients to your blood that it desperately needs.
Things survive for a reason. We incorporated RNA from viruses for a reason. That we have bacteria living in our gut, foreign bacteria living in our gut for good reason.
Very good reason.
And I know that people who are prone to strep throat, people think that they're exposed, and I always explain to my patients, 1 out of 5 people carries strep group B, but you can actually take strep salivarius as a probiotic and put the normal strep, because we should have strep on us and in us. But if you take the normal strep, it doesn't make room for the more pathogenic strep. But the reason that so many people are lacking that could be the Roundup, could be GMO food, the glyphosate, could be vaccines,
and all the antibiotics
that they use for all kinds of things that they really don't need them for.
Yes, right.
And so it is really all. I mean, it might be that it's all a disruption of our flora, our normal flora, which might include things that we think are pathogens or bad for us.
Right.
But really, it's one big ecosystem, and we're
Exactly.
disrupting it.
Yes. I mean, I sort of now think of the pathogens as the ones that need to go into the body to deliver things, because the body is so defective in its own ability to produce those things itself or to deliver them itself. So the body is so broken that these pathogens have to come in to help us out. This is the way I'm framing things these days, and it's been really rewarding to do that, and then to go back and look at the research literature to see if it can fit. And this is a process that I'm involved in exploring. But no, it's very few, very few.
Well, it's certainly anti-industry. I mean, it kind of disrupts the notion that we need more and more drugs and newer generations of antibiotics and more pesticide. I mean, if really we're a part of the ecosystem, we should be balancing the ecosystem. There's no room for these high-tech chemical solutions.
No, we should be pro-life rather than anti-life, and I think this is what we're going to finally realize, and I just hope it won't be too late, because it's very disturbing where we're headed right now. I mean, I think all of the species on the earth are threatened by our notions of how to manage our food and our medicine and everything. We're just anti-life with the vaccines and the antibiotics and the antibacterial soaps and all the chemicals that we put on the food to try to kill off everything, the pests, the insects, the weeds. We just want to kill everything off that isn't the monocrop that we're trying to grow. And as a result, we're basically killing ourselves as well, because we're being exposed to all of these chemicals and anti-life policies that prevent us from being healthy, which is then, I think, why we have such a huge medical crisis in this country, with out-of-control medical costs that will possibly bankrupt the government. Well, I actually have just, given up on getting money from the U.S. government for this kind of work, because I just feel that there's so much. They're so connected to all these industries that are causing these problems: the drug industry, the vaccine industry, and of course the food industry, the chemical industries. I just don't think that it's possible to get money from the U.S. government for this.
Have you tried? Have you filled out grant proposals?
I haven't. I mean, in part that's because I had the funding, right? So it doesn't work that well, I guess, to use that argument.
So
in
the
my
funding
case.
kind of fell into your lap.
Yeah, right. I mean, yes, I was lucky in a way that I was able to repurpose the funding for this, and the company didn't object, because the company wasn't originally funding me to discover all these problems with our health and all these.
But they've been fine with it.
So far, they've been okay with it.
Has anyone from the government, I mean, you're in Boston, you know, you're not in DC, but has any faction of the government, you know, taken a notice of your work and contacted you or been shown an interest?
I would say not. I mean, other than very locally, I was very actively involved in Hawaii, in Kauai, in the recent passage of Bill 2491, which was trying to put some restrictions on the chemical companies that are building. In Kauai, they're developing new GMOs that will be resistant to various other herbicides and whatnot, and using a lot of toxic chemicals, including a lot of Roundup, on the fields that are close proximity to schools of young children, and the children in those schools are getting sick. And so I was very actively involved in that campaign and met with people in the local Kauai county government, and even Kauai, the state, would have nothing to do with it. So even the Kauai at the state level is not reachable, I think, in this issue. But at the county level, there's been a tremendous fight going on against the GMOs in Kauai. And I'm very much in admiration of what they're doing there. I think everything has to be done at the extremely low level. And of course, part of the game is to control the top and then to take away the power at the bottom so that they can't do it. This is the game I think that they're playing.
So centralization of power.
Mm.
I was under the impression that Hawaii voted to ban GMO, or there's something recently.
There's something going on in the big island of Hawaii. And then the Kauai thing is this, not ban GMOs, but they would love to, but they're basically putting restrictions on the companies. There's several companies that are developing these new GMOs.
So new GMOs down the pipeline.
Yes,
Can
research.
you tell
on
us
new
anything about that? I mean, do you know specifically?
I don't know specifically what they're doing, but I can guess that they're doing, developing additional, so for example, you've got GMO corn, which is Roundup Ready, and then because you're getting these resistant weeds, then you have to put 2,4-D and all these other kinds of atrazine and whatnot. So they're probably developing additional resistance to one of these other herbicides on top of Roundup, which would mean then that you can freely spray both of those on that crop and it won't die. And if they succeed in doing that, I hesitate. I cannot imagine what that's going to do to our health once we're getting both the Roundup and the other chemical combined on these foods. Because they're often synergistically much more dangerous than either one individually. They work together to increase the toxicity of each one. So I think that's really disturbing. And first of all, it's disturbing to the people there who are being exposed to the chemicals and getting sick.
Wow. Yeah, it's big news, especially if Argentina, we saw the children get sick.
I know. I mean, I'm hoping that there may be enough coming out of those, what's going on in those places where they're getting really up close and personal with the chemicals, that hopefully eventually that knowledge will get out to the world that these things are toxic, because that's the way you're going to discover it, you know, through these intense exposures.
So do you want to tell us how to improve our sulfate levels?
Well, there is a critical thing that I would like to bring up, which is sunlight. I think sunlight is vital to health. And one of the other industries that we haven't talked about is the sunscreen industry. And they have managed to grow tremendously over the last 30, 40 years. We use 30 times as much sunscreen now as we did 30, 40 years ago, in step with a 2% increase in skin cancer every year for that same period. So while we're using more and more sunscreen, we're getting more and more skin cancer.
Absolutely.
And so everyone says, well, use more sunscreen, you're not using enough. But in fact, I think the sunscreen is actually causing the skin cancer. And a critical reason is because in the high-end sunscreen contains aluminum, and aluminum disrupts the skin's ability to make the sulfate. So it's not just the vitamin D, but it's cholesterol sulfate and vitamin D sulfate that are made in the skin upon sun exposure, also in the pineal gland behind the eyes. Very, very important to supply sulfate to the brain. So sunglasses and sunscreen are both disruptive.
So even mechanical sunscreens, you know, wearing a shirt that blocks
Yes.
the sun. So you want, you know, again, this is contrary to what the industry and what the medical industry tells you, which is, you know, oh, you shouldn't get sun on your skin, it's so damaging. I mean, I personally don't use sunscreen, and I never have, but you know, this is what most people say.
I know, and you know, young parents pay very good attention. I had to work really hard when my first granddaughter was born. She's now 13 years old. And her mom was told by the doctor, oh, make sure, you know, as soon as she's 6 months old, start putting the sunscreen on and make sure to keep her out of, even keeping her out of the sun before 6 months, make sure she's always in the shade and, you know, get into the habit of having her get up in the morning and put the sunscreen before she goes off to school. I was really beside myself with that, and I had to find everything I could on the web and send her material to tell her, no, this is not true, don't let this happen. And so luckily they listened to us, and all my grandchildren have, don't use sunscreen. They have to ask, they have to explain to their camp counselors that they will not put the sunscreen on because their parents won't let them. They have to get a written permission not to use the sunscreen. I mean, it's amazing to me. Sunscreen is really a serious part of the problem. And that feeds directly into the glyphosate because it disrupts the ability to produce the sulfate in the skin, which then is going to further disrupt the bioavailability of sulfate to the blood.
And so the best thing is just to avoid getting burnt.
Yes, of course you don't want to get burnt, but you can build up a nice tan in the spring and then you can handle the summer sun as well, and that's the way you're supposed to do it. I mean, when I was a kid, that's what you did. Everybody did that.
Right. I mean, now there's a big move, and that's a whole other conversation, to getting rid of pigment, and that the pigment is there, the hyperpigment is there to protect you.
Yes, exactly, and it does a really good job, much better than the sunscreen. And the sunscreen, of course, with the aluminum is disruptive. So not only is it blocking the UV, which is then, of course, preventing you from making vitamin D, but it's also aluminum and retinoic acid are both disrupting the sulfate synthesis.
Wow. Wow, it's kind of like everything you thought was true
Is false. Yes, it's pretty much
false.
It's pretty much the case. It's really, truly amazing.
So it's interesting that you brought up your grandchildren. I mean, how does all this knowledge now, how do you take this knowledge and then use it, or how does that affect you as a mother and a grandmother and a wife? You know,
yes,
it's scary stuff. I mean, how
it is. And of course, I am to some extent frustrated because, of course, my children and my grandchildren are all hearing all this other stuff from everybody else, and so they have to question, is mom right or not, right? You don't necessarily persuade them, even though you know, you've studied so much and you know so well. All the factors are getting worse as far as I see. No one seems to be waking up to the idea of using less sunscreen or getting fewer vaccines or eating organic food. I mean, organic food is improving, but at the same time as pesticides are going up and up and up. So if you project from the growth of autism over the last 6 years, you can figure that about half the kids are going to have autism by the quarter-century mark. Oh. And so I think we're not going to be able to do much else besides take care of those kids. I mean, our country is going to be so crippled by the care involved, and of course all the pain and anguish of having children with this quite debilitating condition is unimaginable to me. I mean, I just, you know, can't, almost you can't cope with what the future is going to bring.
Well, when you think about your grandchildren having children.
I know. It's just, it seems like the path we're on is so destructive that it has to fail. It has to fail dramatically, and we have to wake up and realize that we have to do everything very, very differently. And so, I mean, the thing that I'm most interested in is the people who are actually walking the walk and talking the talk, growing the food organically, choosing to buy only organic, which is what my husband and I do. We buy 100% organic, is pretty much. I mean, we go to Whole Foods and we buy the organic choices at Whole Foods. We have organic soy sauce, we have organic wine, organic beer. I mean, this is like everything is organic. And other people have to get on board with that. And then consumer pressure will cause the farmers to choose to grow organic, if nothing else will, right? If that's what the consumer wants, that's what the farmer will grow.
But if their farms are contaminated with GMO.
I know. Well, it takes time to rejuvenate the soil. I mean, you can't just suddenly convert to organic when you've got all those chemicals.
No, but you can suddenly decide to grow conventional seeds and not use pesticide, or, you know, so.
Yeah, eventually you'll clear it out and you'll be able to produce healthy food. But I just hope we haven't gone so far down this path that there's no return, you know. So
there could be no return.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to be alive 50 years from now.
It's a scary thought. Not that you're alive 50 years from now. You know, it's a great thought because you're doing such great work. But 50 years from now, if we don't stop the trajectory, and I would love to look at the rate, if we path out, if the regression analysis of autism.
I know.
If we look at that rate, it's exponential.
It's very disturbing.
It's very disturbing. So the work that you do, you know, a lot of researchers have a hypothesis and they set out to prove it or disprove it, right? And so they're creating something in the lab and they're creating something from scratch, and they might have an inherent bias in their work, whether it's conscious or unconscious. But your work seems very different. Your research is very different research. It's taking data that exists in nature, really. It exists in real life from drugs. So it's real life experience that's there already. You're not making it up. You're not creating it. I mean, can you talk about, is your research very different than how most other research works, or is this a growing number of people now doing this kind of pooling what's around this epidemiological work?
Well, I think a lot of people are using the same techniques that I'm using in other areas that are not biology, and I think that increasingly people will be using it in this space. And it's a really powerful way, I think, to get at information that is otherwise missed. Because there's just so much of this stuff to read, and people just can't absorb it all. But if you can let the computer help you out to figure out those connections, and that gives you tremendous hints to then go back and focus on the material and try to understand it better. So there's a real symbiosis between the researcher and the computer who are working together to solve the problem of sort of systems-level biology. And I think this is something actually that should be tremendously funded. I believe what I'm doing with regard to the research literature, not just the data that's on the web, which is also, of course, very valuable. There's a huge research literature out there that people are not taking advantage of. You know, all these little research projects that have revealed little interesting facts about biology, and when you start to pull all of those together and create that larger picture and understand it, ask those questions at the systems level in order to understand how that's working. I think you get big answers, and I think you get potentially revolution in biology.
Well, and what I love about it is that the industry talking points for food and pharma and vaccines, that if you question the safety, you're anti-science.
Yes, I know.
And what I love about your work is that you're taking high-level computer science,
Yes.
it's technology, it is high-tech,
Yes, right.
and you're taking this technology that's science. Clearly you believe in science.
Right, I do.
And you're coming up with these answers, these things that are pointing in directions that show that these
Yes.
other things that we're introducing that happen to be high tech or moderate tech, supposed solutions, that maybe they're actually creating all these basic problems.
Yes.
And you're using a scientific, high tech way of getting to that answer.
Right, right.
So clearly, doing the kind of work that you do, you have to have a great grasp of science
Yes.
and technology.
Yes, and I think that I'm in a unique position because of my background in both biology and computer science, so I can play both sides of both roles in that game, of being the computer scientist to analyze the data, and then being the biologist to interpret it.
Right. Wow. That's great. Thank you so much for the work you're doing.
Thank you.